I want to talk about Otis Blackwell, who wrote Fever for Little Willie John, Breathless and Great Balls of Fire for Jerry Lee Lewis, Don't Be Cruel for Elvis Presley, and many more hit songs, right? And the great Chuck Berry's unacknowledged contribution to rock and roll.
Sure, they both have a lot of unacknowledged contributions to rock and roll. Let's start with Otis Blackwell. Otis Blackwell was a songwriter and a singer, and he had a gift for putting lyrics to music. You mentioned one of Elvis Presley's songs, Don't Be Cruel. That was Elvis Presley's biggest hit of all time, written by a black man named Otis Blackwell. I had the pleasure of being Otis's musical director for 3 years before he passed away. And he also wrote All Shook Up, Return to Sender, Paralyzed, Such an Easy Question, all #1 hits for Elvis Presley. And he was brilliant. He was an introvert. He didn't really come out a whole lot and socialize and things like that. He stayed where he was and wrote songs and composed music. And then one day he decided that he wanted to come out and perform again. When he first started, he was a performer, but then he figured he was taught by Doc Pomus, another great songwriter, that he could make a lot of money writing and selling songs, pitching songs. So he got into that and said, why should I go anywhere and put all this hard work performing and being on stage and putting together a band when I can just write a song, let somebody else do it, and I get paid for it. So Otis Blackwell was a wealthy man. However, he should have had twice as much money from the songs that Elvis Presley recorded. But here's what happened. Elvis had a manager. This is not Elvis Presley's fault. This is the doings of his manager, a fellow named Colonel Tom Parker. Yeah. So Colonel Parker. Now there were, Elvis had other songwriters too, Jerry Lieber and Mike Stoller. Lieber and Mike Stoller were, I should say, Lennon and McCartney were the Lieber and Stoller of the 1960s. Okay, but Lieber and Stoller were some of the greatest duo songwriters, team of songwriters in the 1950s. Wrote a lot of songs for Elvis, the Drifters, the Coasters, and a lot of other people. So anyway, when they wrote a song and Elvis recorded it, Lieber and Stoller got 100% of the writer's royalties, as they are entitled to, right? Otis Blackwell, Colonel Parker told him if he wanted Elvis to record his songs, he had to give Elvis 50% of the writing credit. Now, Elvis never wrote a song in his life, okay? Understand also, Colonel Parker, who was Elvis's manager, was getting 50% of Elvis Presley. Now, that's unheard of in the industry, right? An agent gets anywhere between 10 and 20%. A manager gets anywhere between 20 and 35%. Colonel Parker was getting 50% of Elvis. Yes. Okay, so you write a song, you're Otis Blackwell, you write a song, and Elvis Presley records it, you have to give Elvis 50% of the writing credit. So he gets royalties for something he didn't do, and then Colonel Parker gets 50% of Elvis. So it's like 25-25. Now, Elvis was not savvy to all this, and that was not his doing. But that's how Colonel Parker treated Otis Blackwell. And I once asked Otis, when we were together performing and all that, or just practicing or whatever, I said, why would you let them do that? He said, Darryl, you have to understand something. Back in the 1950s, it was hard for a black man to make a living, let alone playing rock and roll, because rock and roll was not accepted by the establishment, the white establishment, because it was black music and people thought it was corrupting white youth and all that kind of crazy nonsense, right? So he said it was hard enough to make a living as a black man, playing this music that was unacceptable, but also 50% of Elvis Presley was a lot of money. And everything he gave Elvis, went to #1. So, but he would have had 50% more. Now, when he wrote Great Balls of Fire for Jerry Lee Lewis, another friend of mine, and he got full writing credit for that.
Where did he learn? Did he ever break down? Like, I'm always interested in hearing people's writing process and also their process of becoming a great writer. Did he ever break that down to you?
No, not in specifics, but we were talking in general, and he had teenagers in mind, America's youth, and so he wrote to that, to that degree.
But that's wild though. Like as he distanced himself in age, how was he still able to write things to connect with teenagers?
Well, because he was a teenager himself at one time.
I got you.
And there's certain things that are common to teenagers. Love for one thing, chasing girls, all that kind of thing. And Chuck Berry would do the same thing. And Chuck Berry was the oldest of the rock and rollers.
All right, I want to get into Chuck Berry now. He's another legend that is kind of, I don't want to say he's written out of history, but it seems like he doesn't get as much acknowledgement and praise as he should.
That is correct. Just like most black musicians. Chuck Berry is the inventor of rock and roll. He would never tell you that, but he is. There was no rock and roll before Chuck Berry. Did people record songs before Chuck Berry? Sure, but they weren't rock and roll. All right. Chuck Berry, I played for Chuck Berry for 32 years. Not every gig, but many gigs. And this man was a genius. And geniuses are wired a little different than the normal person. Anybody can say, I played the guitar and I wrote a song and some other person sings my song, and that's great. But how many people can say I invented a genre of music? Like I said, he would never say that, but he did. Beethoven did. Jimi Hendrix did. They came up with a whole different genre of music. And back in the day, black people were not given credit for their inventions or their discoveries, but they were used commercially by everybody. And then, many, many years later, they began to start getting credit. Also, this new music that Chuck Berry invented, and then along comes Little Richard, who also contributed a lot. Bo Diddley, Fats Domino. These are the creators of this genre, rock and roll. Elvis Presley, Jerry Lee Lewis, Carl Perkins, Bill Haley and the Comets, Buddy Holly, and other great white performers of this genre. They're the ones who popularized it. They did not invent it; they popularized it because they had access to more powerful radio stations. In order to sell records, you have to be heard by the public. And black radio stations did not have a lot of wattage. They're exactly the neighborhood, whereby these white stations, and this was before FCC regulations, they could broadcast all the way across the state into the next state and so forth and so on. It was like unchained territory or something. So the wider your reach, the more people hear it, the more people go to the record store and purchase your record.
How has history of rock and roll been whitewashed, both in literature and in film?
Sure. Oftentimes it's portrayed as a white person's music. Music belongs to everybody. Music is to be shared, but you must give credit where credit is due. And whites did not invent rock and roll. That's why a lot of black pictures of black artists were not put on album covers or on 45 sleeves of the records, because they didn't want the white radio stations to know that these people were black. Otherwise, they wouldn't play them. If you had a voice that had like perfect elocution and diction, and you were black, don't put the picture on the album or the record, because that way they wouldn't know. And so, like people like Nat King Cole, the Platters, Johnny Mathis, you're right, they got airplay. Little Richard, Muddy Waters, that person sounds too black to be played on this station.